society can provide their inputs and ensure that those reports are considered by the government. How strong is the national platform in doing so is another question. There is also a technical information I can share on the Sendai Framework Monitor that while each country has been given one person who can access, who actually has the right to log into the system and input the report, that person has all authority to share and delegate the reporting rights to anybody that person wants to. And theoretically speaking, that person can be from the civil society. It all depends on the government. I have a few examples from this region itself where a government has decided that given the strong support that the civil society has been providing to the government, and the data in most cases rests with the civil society, they have given the access to that system to the civil society in that country. The civil society organizations input the data, but the validation process goes through the government again. So there are multiple ways through the reporting process can be shared, but accountability lies with the government.
So, use proper compliance will be very useful in the next year.
Yes, so William has just brought up that one important entry point and way that civil society can engage is through Views from the Frontline, which is a global initiative to collect, reflect on and act on local perspectives on risk and resilience. What's important about Views from the Frontline is that it is capturing the voices of those who don't normally have a voice, and there's capacity building and financial support for different actors to then use those findings, that local data to inform policy, to inform local action, to inform the national advocacy that we might be doing. There'll be a session on Views from the Frontline tomorrow for us all to attend, and we'll be letting you know the plans for the project and the 4 different ways that you can engage. So for now, I'd just like to turn back to Animesh and ask him to present a little bit more on the entry points for civil society to engage in these DRR strategies, and I believe that you've got a couple of slides on that.
I promise this will be my last presentation. So can we have the first slide? Oh, okay, just together. Okay, so it's a very quick 3-slide presentation where I would take some data from the survey that I was mentioning earlier in terms of what's happening at the national local level, but what Lucy just presented from the civil society is actually very interesting, because you will see that the government perspectives and the civil society perspectives on coordination at the national local level are very well synergized. I mean, they are not very disparate. So just a few figures again on what's happening at the national level in this region. So there was a milestone set that 40% of the countries in the region would have a functioning national platform by 2018. We have been informed in the region that we have actually exceeded this target, so more than 40% in the region have a national platform. It could be in the form of a council, a committee, or a commission, or another coordination mechanism. Doesn't matter what we call it, but they are a national platform where different stakeholder groups, international organizations, and the government can sit together. In some cases, they are at the policy level to decide what should happen in the country. In some cases, it's very operational, including just having an emergency task force, which is useful, but not from the Sendai Framework implementation point of view. Some of the national platforms are actually backed by legislation, which has a proper terms of reference of the national platform, which defines what should be the membership for each of the national platform in different countries. Some meet very regularly, some meet as a conference, and that puts a question mark on the sustainability of these national platforms. If the national platforms start meeting as a conference, like once a year, big gathering, sessions, doesn't work. It's very exhaustive in resources and time of the people. But if it meets on a more regular basis, I have a few examples from Africa. I would say Ethiopia, where I was there for several years. Third Thursday, 10 o'clock every month, no invitations are sent out. People gather in the government conference room and they have the national platform meeting. It's a regular, sustained model. The only resource which goes into it is the cost of the tea. And that also is it's a small budget. But annually, there's no much allocation. It's a sustained model. While in the case of many other countries, they organize the first session of the national platform or the second session of the national platform. That happens every year or every 2 years. It's not a very sustained model. The levels of engagement of the stakeholder groups varies across space, and at the national level, as also was pointed out earlier from the civil society survey, it's the same. It's only half of the countries reported that the engagement levels are high. It was interesting to note what was mentioned, that mostly international NGOs dominate civil society representation in these national platforms, because the governments haven't said so. They just mentioned civil society, but perhaps it's a painting of the whole stakeholder group into one category. It could be that the international NGOs are dominating the national platform when it comes to civil society representation. But that has different connotations. It also is an onus on the civil society that how far are the doors open, and can they approach the governments to see that, okay, we want to place in the national platform and provide our advice. So that's a two-way process. On the Coherence side, it appears at national level, still the focus is largely on disaster risk management, and very few countries, recently Philippines, has come out with a good example of establishing a resilience council where multiple agendas can come together, facilitated by the private sector as well. Now, coming to the local platforms, it's not a very good picture. So the national plans and strategies of different countries do provide provisions for local platforms, but very few countries have established provincial or local DRR coordination mechanisms. The decentralized and devolved DRM responsibility often facilitates local platform. So if the DRM is a devolved or a decentralized responsibility in a country, it facilitates the formation or establishment of local platforms. If DRM is not a devolved subject for the country's work, it affects the formation of local platforms, because the local governments then don't see their role in disaster management. That was also pointed out earlier. Countries who do not have a national platform definitely do not have a local platform. So often it's seen as a sequential process, that first you establish a national platform and then a local platform. So the bottoms-up approach perhaps doesn't work here. And where local platforms exist, the stakeholder engagement, in particular the civil society engagement, is much, much, much stronger than at the national level. Again, points to the note that perhaps the civil society has a much greater role to play at the local level than at the national level. Goes without saying, it's a very obvious point. Now, having said that, what are the entry points? And this is just what we had a consultation internally and proposal for you, but I would be very happy to hear that what you think are the entry points to help us to inform our own policies and strategies on DRR coordination. At the global and regional level, of course, we organize these global and regional platforms, provides a level playing field to all the stakeholder groups, including civil society, to voice their opinion, which gets reflected in the outcome documents. These outcome documents then in turn are distilled down to the national and local level and provides hence a good window of opportunity to multiple civil society organizations to influence policy. The consultations that I was pointing out in the previous presentation for the Words into Action guideline is another process to influence the policy. You have every right and every door open to provide your feedback on these Words into Action guideline, which subsequently will be used to develop the national strategies and local strategies. If that be the case, and if you can influence the guideline itself, then perhaps that's a very good way to attack civil society engagement and approach it from the guideline and policy point of view. At the national and local level, what we often face a bottleneck as a UN organization or as UN ISDR, for example, each country has given us a Sendai framework focal point. In most cases, or I would say in all the cases, all the countries, 193 countries that we have allocated the focal point from the DRM or disaster management focal agency. And in most countries that happens to be Ministry of Interior or Civil Protection or Defense or National Disaster Management Agencies. Creates a bit of a challenge for us, because then we have limited opportunities to talk to the sectoral ministries. We have limited opportunities to talk to the ministries of finance, planning, development. The NGOs and the civil society have a more diverse stake. Your counterpart could be Ministry of Agriculture, your counterpart could be Ministry of Environment, depends what area you're working on. And if then we approach through your means to the respective sectoral ministry or the ministries responsible for planning and development, perhaps we can really bank on your approach to the government to distill DRR as a multi-sector responsibility. I see that as the biggest role that perhaps civil society can play. The engagement, as I pointed out in the previous slide, at the local level is much stronger. Most organizations which are at our level, at the policy level, working as a custodian organization, we don't have outreach at the local level, but the civil society comes from the bottoms-up approach. You have the real outreach at the local level. If that be the case, you have the real stake in terms of influencing the local policies, strategies, and the platforms. It was said that once, when I asked a very learned person that for you, what is coherence and how does it get implemented? And I was told that the real coherence happens at the level of implementation, at the community level. That's where it actually gets implemented. For a community member, it does not matter that what's happening in their locality is whether it is Paris Agreement or Sendai Framework or SDG or New Urban Agenda, does not matter. What matters to them is the day-to-day problems that they face. And if that be the case, that's where the real coherence happens. We are not present there. It's the civil society which is present at the community level, and hence gives a big opportunity to influence the community level engagement in DRR. 2 points in terms of the commitments, and that points to also what I was mentioning earlier in terms of the role of the civil society in monitoring. At the World Conference in 2015, multiple organizations had made commitments for implementation of the Sendai Framework. And those were the third big outcome of the Sendai Conference in 2015. We are also monitoring those commitments while we are monitoring the government's progress on implementation of the Sendai Framework. As we speak, a system is being developed and very shortly launched to monitor the voluntary commitments of any organization, and the door is not closed. It was not just at the World Conference. You have the option to revising your existing commitment or announce new commitment, registering your commitment in that registry, and we will continue to monitor and can provide your own data to us to ensure that all the work that you are doing is not going unnoticed, but is also being monitored through a collaboration of UN and the civil society. Similarly, regional commitments are also being made. At the last 2016 Asian Ministerial Conference, series of commitments were made, and we have just received reports regionally from them, from all the networks, and these will be presented in the Mongolia conference that I was talking about earlier. And again, at the SDG level, the voluntary national reviews, the VNRs, again have to be developed by the countries through a consultative process, and there are more than a dozen DRR-related VNRs that also are being presented and discussed. So that again provides a huge opportunity to the civil society to register their commitments. So I would end my presentation with some of the good practices that we have been implementing, and one example was just given by a colleague from Indonesia on the local level resilience. And there is a bit of a debate going on whether is there at all a necessity to develop disaster risk management plans and strategies at the local level, when I just mentioned that the real coherence happens at the local level. If I bring these two together, we are actually conflicting and making contradicting points, that we need to ensure coherence at the local level, but then we need DRR plans separately from the other development plans. Why can't we ensure that at the local level, the plans are risk informed and may not necessarily mean a DRM plan in separation, otherwise it will just end in a shelf and never being implemented. So if that be the case, what we are doing is that we have launched a few years back, all of us are aware of the Making Cities Resilient campaign. So far, 4,000 cities globally have joined this campaign, and now we are taking this word into action, advocacy translated into action, through piloting a project in 20 specific cities globally, wherein at the local level, in collaboration with the respective local governments, risk assessments are being done at the community level, at the local level, where civil society is playing a huge role. So we are looking at the past disasters which have happened in the localized level. We're looking at the risk profile for the future. What are the future hazards that may happen? And there are tools which have been developed for this process by UNICEF. And these scorecards are then used to develop a resilience action plan. We're not calling it DRR action plan. We're calling it resilience action plan. And the very reason we are calling it Resilience Action Plan is the point that we're not focusing only on disaster management point, but to look at the overall resilience of a city, of a community, or at the local level. So this experience from the 20 cities will be scaled up very soon to multiple other cities. And then again, I would call upon all of you to collaborate with UNISDR to ensure that we can multiply this effort into so many cities, because we are so small that we can't go beyond a certain set of cities. So we would definitely look for further collaboration and partnership so as to scale from 20 to 100 to 2,000 in the near future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. We have received an interesting comment from online from our member from Cameroon, Boo. I think a few of you have met Boo before and worked with him on some of the views from the frontline work. So Boo says, this is an important discussion there, which to the best of my knowledge, a couple of countries from this end are still to put in place DRR plans. But as well as highlighted, this is a government-led process and we can only lobby and advocate for this to happen in our respective countries. Still, CSOs have a great role to play, which requires the necessary political will, providing space for CSOs to contribute. So Boo has pointed out a few different things there to think about in terms of our roles and some of the realities that we have to bear in mind, that it is primarily the state that needs to be leading this, and that CSOs perhaps have a role more on advocating and lobbying to some degree to help share some of the lessons from other countries. So I now just wanted to go out to people in the audience to have a bit of a reality check. Many of you are working on this, working towards helping your government develop DRR strategies. Many of the governments in the room are trying to desperately develop DRR strategies by this tight deadline of 2020. And I wanted to invite a couple of specific people first to comment on some of the realities that they are observing and some of the work they are doing to try and counter that. And first of all, I'd like to invite Marijke Bentfield, who is a junior expert at the Global Initiative for Disaster Risk Management at GIZ, which is a German development agency, who's going to share a little bit about the reality of this challenge of coherence when developing these DRR strategies, coherence with the other priorities and agendas that governments have to work with, and some of the work that GIZ are doing to support that.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction. So Lucy already mentioned, for the people who haven't bumped into GIZ in your respective countries, GIZ is the German Development Agency. We work mainly for the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And GIZ is working on a lot of different issues, for example, peace and security, economic development and employment, but also climate change and environment and energy-related issues. So I'm here on behalf of the Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management, which, as you can see, is also funded by the BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of the German government. And we are working globally, even though not as global as GNDR is doing. So we have offices in Bonn and Berlin, in Santiago de Chile, and in Bangkok, Thailand. So this is what we are currently doing. And we just started recently in February 2018, so it's a pretty new program, and we're going to work on coherence issues in the next 3 years. So actually some of the main things you should take from this project objective are actually highlighted. So it's related to coherence with regard to planning, implementing and reporting along all the different global agendas that have been adopted post-2015. So focusing on the Sendai framework, but also taking into account the Paris Agreement, Agenda 2030, and also the New Urban Agenda. So this is a brief graphic showcasing how we are working. So we're working on 3 different levels: on the national, on the subnational, on the regional, on the global level. So today, I mean, this is really just for your information. I'm not going to talk too much about it. What I'm going to present today is actually some of the work we are doing on national and subnational level in the Philippines. So I'm sorry that we're always coming back to the Philippine examples. It seems there is going on a lot. But there's one example that we found that I think will be interesting for you to see as well, and it really shows how CSOs can engage in a way, and also how you can achieve more coherence on a subnational level when it comes to implementing the global agendas. So this is more or less our starting point. So this is where we are coming from, because there are so many global agendas, there are so many requirements, so many different indicators that have to be achieved on all the different levels. And what happens most of the time is that all these agendas are actually coming to local government, and then they are actually asked to complete everything and to provide like a report within like no time, as you can see in this picture. And so this is like the starting point, and now I will show you how this exact picture is actually looking in the Philippines, and what we are right now supporting to ensure that the person being completely overwhelmed is a little bit less overwhelmed and is actually able to contribute better. So we have the Philippines, and they actually committed to all the 5 global agendas in the post-2015 agenda world. So they are definitely going to be very busy. And what's happening is that, as we've heard a couple of times before, I mean, there are all the different line ministries who are responsible to translate and localize these global agendas into something that can actually be implemented on the ground. And this is happening. I mean, all the different line ministries are very busy. They are providing the technical guidelines for the local government units, and they are all localizing whatever has been included in the global agendas. But then at the local level, obviously there is like an overburden, because they need to report, they actually need to do the implementation, and there is like just an overload of different things they need to do, a lot of different things they need to take into account, and it's just difficult. And I mean, it's easy to see why it's difficult. I mean, we would be overwhelmed as well. So what we are proposing, or what the process is actually, I mean, there is a process happening in the Philippines anyway, and under this global initiative we are supporting this process in order to come up with a more coherent planning process. So what's happening, as you can see, is that the OCD, the Office of Civil Defense, the Climate Change Commission, and the Department of Interior and Local Governments, they actually combined their efforts in a way, and they decided to come up with a combined DRR, CCA, and CCM plan. So now disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation are actually combined in just one plan. And this is part actually of the requirements by the Office of Budget Allocation, the Department of Budget and Management. So in order to access funds, the Local Disaster Risk Management Fund by the Philippine government, the LGUs actually do have to submit this local resilience plan now, instead of coming up with all these different plans for different purposes. And I will just quickly show you the process. So this has already been done in Consolacion, which is one municipality in Cebu province. So you've seen Balz earlier from the government of Cebu. So he will probably be able to tell you even more details about the exact processes that have been happening there. But Consolacion, they came up with their combined plan, and what I think is even more interesting for you today is the following. So they also established an implementing structure in order to implement the plan I just showed you. And what's interesting here is that, first of all, this is actually representing the normal DRM, national DRM structure, but on local level they also included climate change adaptation now, in order to ensure that, for example, resources that are being used or that are requested can be used for both issues at the same time, and there's no more overlap, no duplication of activities, so resources can be used in a more efficient way. And what this implementing clause also shows is that CSOs are actually already included, as you can see, so they are part of this management structure and part of the implementation structure. So last but not least, I just want to how to say that, raise your attention to one other regional structure that the Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management is going to set up in, unfortunately, only Asia Pacific for now. And this is going to be launched at the Asian Ministerial Conference on DRR that Animesh was mentioning a couple of times in July this year in Mongolia. And the idea behind is that, for example, governments or just like stakeholders from different countries are coming to all these global meetings or regional meetings, and we always see a lot of like good examples of things that could be happening. I mean, even here in this conference, I mean, there have been so many like best practices, but then normally people go home afterwards and there's no possibility to connect again and to really learn from each other. So this Coherence practice group is trying to be a solution to this problem. So it means that after all these regional and also global meetings, countries and stakeholders from the specific countries, they could connect via this Coherence practice group, and they could actually be supported in, for example, doing like peer-by-peer learning missions in different countries to really understand, for example, what Constellation has been doing. So why not send someone from Indonesia, from local government unit there, to Constellation to actually like sit together and really learn. So this is something that is going to be supported by the Global Initiative for the next 2.5 years now, because we already started working. But so I just leave it with that. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to just like come and talk to me later on to get some more details on what exactly we are planning in the next years and what the focus of our work is going to be.
Thank you so much, Marika, and not just thank you for speaking today, but actually GIZ is funding this gathering, so a real commitment from GIZ to both building resilience and multi-stakeholder collaboration, so we really appreciate it. Thank you. So now let's spend the next 20 minutes talking to you guys. Let's hear from you about the realities that you are facing in trying to input into these DRR strategies. Who wants to share a challenge they're facing, or a good example, or a bit of a reality? Okay, I can see Zakir, and then Lloyd at the back. So, and also, okay, oh, I can look up to you, great. Zakir first.
Thank you, Mr. Onimus. Thank you, Mr. Onimus and Veronica. Am I right? Am I right? Sorry. Well, as a local people, I don't see myself anywhere. Because as a local people, I am not a stakeholder. As a local people, I am not anything but only beneficiaries. When development plan and policies put a 50-meter long bridge on a 100-meter wide canal and mark it as a disaster risk informed development, while I see that the canal is dying, but policy says there is no risk, there is no disaster risk. So, risk-informed development doesn't ensure us to free the locality from disasters risk. So, I'm requesting to set up some common guideline from common sense that this should not be done. You shouldn't clear our local ecosystem in the name of development and report back that it is risk-free development. The other point is local platforms. Local platforms should have to be engaged all in society, not only the vested groups. Words into action is I believe myself, as I have been in 4 working groups, it is going to be the best guideline ever we have in the globe. I am looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you, Zakir.
Thank you.
So Zakir there has shared a reality of a real grassroots organisation Zakir is from, and that you don't feel that you're being included, and it's very hard to find that entry point, but that you have been able to input into the words into action guide, which is great, and that you're very hopeful for that, so that's really good. But there's a challenge on the perspective of what counts as risk-informed development, and that often local stakeholders' views on what that equates to is different from different stakeholders. It's really interesting. I think we had Lloyd. I can see a few more. I'm taking note of you. That's great. So Lloyd, please share with us a reality you're facing from a CSO in developing these DRR strategies.
No, I think I will share with you some experiences from both Myanmar and India. And these are the 2 countries where I am based. So Myanmar, 10 years ago, had Cyclone Nargis. As part of this, there was the National Action Plan, and this has been under implementation. A second phase, since the new government came into power, was developed from 2017 to 2020. It's a different context because it's a different government, but not only at the national level, but at the sub-national level, as well as the various ministries have been involved. So there is progress, there is slow implementation, but it's a qualitatively changed environment from 10 years ago. Similarly, India. I would say, if you recall, the tsunami was another turning point for India. And prior to that, 5 years before the tsunami, we had the Odisha super cyclone and efforts to re-engage. In the 13 years since the tsunami, you have set up NDMAs, SDMAs, and DDMAs, national, state, and district. And there is uneven progress, but there is significant progress. So, similarly, in civil society coordination, there is more active work going on. So I think we need to, I can talk much longer, but I will not. We need to keep focus on consolidating the improvements which have been achieved and using the good examples to motivate others. This is one, and this is both at the civil society level, at the local government level, at the provincial government level, and at the national government level. And also engaging with the private sector. And a lot more needs to be done. So let's count the positives while recognizing that there is huge amounts which need to be done. And one last point, I always give a pitch for volunteerism, so let me make it now. We need to recognize that not all the work needs to be done with donor-funded initiatives, because this is important, but not enough. It can never cover the whole spectrum. So there are volunteers in civil society who are willing to work, sometimes for free, sometimes not for free, and we need to engage with them and bring them into the picture. So I would encourage us to think creatively and afresh in bringing them through. Red Cross is one constant source of volunteerism. There are other civil society networks, and I think this is part of the future. It's going to be challenging, but it's going to be needed.
Thank you, Lloyd. So I think Lloyd made a couple of calls to the room there and to the broader group of us that, first of all, let's think about those achievements. And one of the ones you particularly mentioned, Lloyd, was the coordination of civil society.